We are live and we are now a continuation of our existing budget workshop. We began last night and will continue again this evening. We are going from 5 till 9 this evening until we get our capital budget, utility budget put to bed. So at this point, I'm going to ask, we left off at renewal. Just one last question before I move into growth. We did review renewal last night on page 88 of the capital budget. No one had any concerns on the 5 items on renewal. So I'll ask one more time before we go on to growth. If anybody has any concerns or questions on questions on the renewal portion, the top part of page 88. Okay, seeing none, move into growth. And what I'd like to do is I've asked Mr. DeBlanco to say a couple things, a couple questions for him. First of all, what I'd like him to do is 2 things. First of all, just walk us through, Mr. DeBlanco, just on the columns to the right, grants, reserves, pay-as-you-go, offsite levy, and debt. Just explain how those 4 funding models work. Mostly talk about pay-as-you-go. That's probably the most complicated of the ones that are there. And once Mr. DeBlanco has done that, I'll ask him one further question. Then we'll get into the growth part of the budget. So Mr. DeBlanco, please, if you could.
Thank you. So if I can, what I'll do is I'll kind of give a summary of page 88 as a whole. And starting at the top, just set the context on renewal. It is at the top of the page by design, in that renewal and replacement of the existing assets of the city are the highest priority in a capital budget. There are 5 programs there, each renewal and replacement programs, and they are all funded via reserves that are contributed by the operating budgets. Those reserves and the city's reserves as a whole, particularly the capital reserves, they are set aside specifically for renewal and replacement. There are some specific reserves, notably the traffic safety reserve, that is used to fund traffic safety programs and projects. That would be considered the kind of an exception to the rule around reserves, where we have a reserve dedicated to new growth pieces. So renewal reserves very intertwined in that funding source for our renewal projects is coming from reserves, and those, in most cases, reserves are not used to fund growth projects. Coming down to that growth section, once again, this is where administration has set forth projects that are required, administration feels are required to service the needs of the city. And within that growth, we have specific funding sources dedicated to growth-related projects. The 2 notable ones are grants and pay-as-you-go are most common, and debt is the third one. Debt has a explicit impact on taxes in that, debt is added to pay for a project. That debt must be paid off, and it must be paid from an operating budget. So that in that case, debt is used to fund on typically larger projects. On a lot of cases for the city, it's facilities that have a life that is, could be 20, 30 years. So that the payment for that facility, we'll use facility as an example, is paid for over the life of the facility. That way, the taxes that are being collected in a given year are paid for a facility that is currently in use. When we look at grants, the city receives, I'll maybe draw council's attention really quick to page 116, which is the section of the book that covers capital funding sources, and we're looking at government transfers. So the city receives 2 major grant allocations. First one being the Municipal Sustainability Initiative, and that's from the province of Alberta. The city's allocation for 2023 is just over 2 million. And the city's allocation on another grant pool, which is the Canada Community Building Fund, formerly federal gas tax, obviously from the federal government, is 1.1 million. So that gives the city an overall kind of annual allocation of approximately $3.1 million from grants from other governments. Pay-as-you-go is, if I were to simplify it for anyone listening at home or council, it's almost like a grant that the city provides to itself. Okay, so we have a grant from the federal government, there's a grant from the provincial government. This is tax levy funding that is going towards capital. So it's coming from the tax levy. There's an allocation of $807,000, give or take, that goes from the city's operating budget right to the city's capital budget. And the rationale for a pay-as-you-go type funding mechanism is to allow the city more flexibility and not have to necessarily adhere to program guidelines And in some cases, it allows the city to provide a municipal contribution towards a larger project where a city may utilize grants. A lot of times grants have requirements that they'll fund 75% of a project, for instance, as long as the city contributes their 25% allocation. So that's a funding source that will allow the city to contribute towards a growth project and meet those program guidelines to use other grants. Offsite levies are a specific funding source allocated to specific projects. They're developer funded and they reflect the need to add growth in the terms of the city's infrastructure on arterial roads, water and wastewater infrastructure as a result of new development. Hence offsite levy, adding to offsite areas. I skipped over a section there, but the third section below renewal and growth is utility. Much like the renewal section at the top, utility projects, particularly utility renewal, are funded from reserves, notably the utility reserve. That utility reserve, rather than being funded from taxes, is being funded from utility rates. And we can see, particularly on utility, we do have stormwater growth. This is addition to the stormwater infrastructure. And because it is new infrastructure, it's being funded from grants. So that's kind of the overview. When we look at the funding mechanisms, particularly on growth, assuming we're not talking about a large project that's going to be in service for a long number of years, something that would be debt funded, the two main ones for the projects on here are grants and pay-as-you-go. The full amount of pay-as-you-go has been allocated in administration's proposed budget. So it can be assumed that any new project within the budget is likely to be paid from grants. That being said, once all final decisions are made, there may be some shifting between the grant pool and the pay-as-you-go fund. This time I'll ask Mr. Daller if he has any other comments or if I've missed anything. Other than that, I'll turn it back.
Nope, that's very helpful, Mr. Blanco. Thank you very much. And my second question is, on page 116, you referred out to already the MSI and the Canada Community Building Fund, formerly the gas tax. Based on the current budget in front of us, we're going to draw 1.7 million from that fund, those two grant funds, leaving us a balance of 6,272,409. Can you just briefly outline the rationale for administration to assume to leave a fairly large amount in those two reserves? And so should any member of council wish to bring forward some capital projects from future years back into 2023 and use these two funding sources, how might it affect any future projects? So give us an idea of why that amount is. It's a good amount to have, but it's also there for a reason. So let us know the thought patterns on that before we get into the growth part of the capital budget, please.
Sure. There's a couple reasons why there's a balance there that isn't completely allocated. I'll draw council's attention to page 124, which is the third page of the 5-year capital plan. I'll give a second to flip there, but the first kind of gray highlighted line is the total for growth. So if we look at 2023, we have 5.4 million. If we look at 2024, there's 7.3. And in years 25 through 26 or through 27, there's some large numbers there. 38 million, 32 million, 22 million. There are notably some large facility requests within the city, things like performing arts centers, libraries, fire halls, city halls, RC&P buildings. For large projects like that, it is likely that some amount of debt is going to be required to be added to the city's books. We add those numbers up, it's in excess of what the city's going to receive for grants and pay-as-you-go. If you look at pay-as-you-go and grants and consider them, if you want to think about pay-as-you-go as a city-funded grant, as I do, it's around 4.8 million is what the annual contribution towards growth is. Well, 4.8 doesn't quite keep up with 5.4, 7.3, and 38 million. And when we look at specifically the delta there between the grant and pay-as-you-go pool and the growth amount here, there is going to be a number offset by debt. So when we look at those debt numbers, specifically, let's use 30 million as an example, that has, based on current interest rates, that has a tax impact of approximately 7%. So any amount that can be retained in the grant pool and can be contributed toward those large projects, that reduces the overall debt impact in future years. So by not allocating everything in say 2023, what that does is remain some of these grant funds to help offset that debt burden in future years.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. So with that, I have a quick comment from last night. Procedurally speaking, I wasn't where I could do something like this to help move things along. So last night when Councillor Tessier suggested adding the 25,000 to the spray park project, and then one councillor suggested want to support the idea, but didn't know how that 25 grand would be spent. We got into a bit of a discussion how it was spent and kind of went down a couple of rabbit holes trying to figure out how to spend it. What we could have done procedurally, which I wasn't aware of, but now I am from talk administration today, is that we could have voted on the motion of the 25,000 first of all, and had it carried, have a subsequent motion for a report to come back on how best to spend that 25,000 at a later time. And if council agree with that report, if you spent that way. If not, we can send it back to administration for a redo rather than trying to figure out while we're sitting here. So it may save some time on some future discussion this evening. I wasn't aware we could do that. I was also thinking it makes sense before I could vote on it, how it's going to be spent. I kind of got that logic of the question, but it kind of put us down a rabbit hole we didn't need to go down because we could procedurally get out of it. So I will be more cognizant of that this evening and try and keep us at the higher level and not get too deep in the weeds on some of the details as best we can. But that's part of our job too, right? So I'll try and strike that balance between questions and staying at a higher level with our budget. Last comment before we start on growth is that this is the fun part of the budget for council administration. This is where we get to build stuff. And you see the rec center, you see the basketball court, you see the ball diamonds, the dog park, artificial turf field. That's all stuff we get to build, and that's all part of growth. And that's a fun part of the budget. So water lines and sewer lines aren't exactly very sexy, but they're necessary. This is the fun part. So with that, I'm going to begin with council on the growth section on page 88. It starts at the joint high school site assembly and it works its way down to traffic safety program. What I'd like to do, if we can, is maybe begin with questions, thoughts, concerns, clarification questions on any part of the growth items we have there. And then I'll entertain ideas on motions to add to the growth or make some changes. So with that, is there a member of council willing to start us off with the discussion on the growth? Councillor Tessier, do you have a question? I wasn't anticipating. I thought we'd simply say, I have a question, for example, on fleet. I know Councillor Barnhart has a question on fleet and equipment. So we could, if she starts us off, we'll start there. Or we'll simply go into general discussion. So, by the way, Councillor Barnhart, quick sound check. Can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can, Mayor. Can you hear me?
Yep. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate that. So, shall we begin with growth? We can, if you like. Yeah, I'm being fairly flexible this evening and kind of see where council wants to go with discussions. And I do have, we have a few motions coming. So, Councillor Miller, Ashley, you have the floor.
Sure. Thank you. I guess if we're going down the list, we're going to start with the high school site assembly. So
Sure, we
I have
can.
a question for that. I may have a couple questions later, but we'll see where the conversation goes. I just wanted to talk about the 3.4. Given the fact that we haven't actually secured a site yet, who am I directing my question to? I don't even know. Oh, Kendra. Okay, thank you. We haven't secured a site yet, the 3.4. I guess, can you elaborate on that number? Is it going to go up or down, or how is that decided?
Ms. Raymond, are you able to disclose what you can in an open session, if you could, please? Or...
Yeah, through the mayor to Councillor Miller. Think based on previous discussions that we've had.
Ms. Raymond, sorry, may I ask, is it more appropriate to go into closed session?
Yes, it would be more appropriate to go into closed session.
That's fair.
Let's do that. Ms.
fair.
Gouget, or sorry, Ms. Winter, can you give us a motion to move into closed session? We can discuss this topic. Councillor Miller, would you prepare to move us into closed session, please?
Yes, I will move that council move into closed session pursuant to the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, Section 25 at 5:14 p.m.
Thank you, Councillor.
Yep.
Discussion on the motion? Seeing none, Council, would you please vote to go into camera for this particular topic? Councillor Barnhart, how do you vote?
In favor?
Thank you. Council, that carries unanimously. Thank you. We will move into closed session and return to open session after discussion